The man next door. It was supposed to be a fresh start. David had just moved into the quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. A small, cozy house with a worn porch and a neat, well-kept yard. After the chaos of the city, the peace and silence of this place felt like a blessing. He was looking forward to the calm, the routine, the quiet evenings. But his new neighbor, Mr. Finch, was about to change everything. David first met Mr. Finch on the day he moved in. The man had appeared out of nowhere, standing in his driveway, with a strange, crooked smile that stretched far too wide for comfort. "I'm your neighbor," Mr. Finch had said, his voice soft but unsettlingly deep. His clothes were old-fashioned, a tattered suit with a bow tie that looked out of place in the modern world. His eyes, though, were the worst part. They were dark, almost black, and they never seemed to blink. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he had added with a strange chuckle. "I'm sure we'll get along just fine." David had smiled back, not wanting to be rude, but he felt an immediate unease. There was something wrong about Mr. Finch, something that didn't sit right with him. Still, he brushed it off. After all, it was just a neighbor. The first few days went by without incident, but soon David started to notice odd things. Every time he went outside to check the mail or water the plants, Mr. Finch was watching him from his window. Not just a casual glance. His eyes would be fixed on him, staring through the glass with an intensity that made David feel like he was being studied. It wasn't just once or twice, it was every single time. David decided to confront him. One evening, after seeing Mr. Finch's figure behind the curtains yet again, he walked next door, his heart pounding in his chest. When he knocked, it took a while for Mr. Finch to answer. When he did, the door creaked open, revealing the same crooked smile. "Mr. Finch," David said, trying to sound polite but firm, "is everything all right? You've been staring at my house a lot lately." For a long moment, Mr. Finch didn't speak. He just stood there, his smile not wavering, his dark eyes locked on David's. Then, with a slow nod, he finally spoke. "Oh, I do apologize," he said, his voice thick and raspy. "You see, I just like to observe. It's a habit of mine." David felt a shiver run down his spine. "Observe? I don't think it's normal to stare at people like that." Mr. Finch leaned closer, his face inches away from David's. "You'd be surprised what you can learn by watching," he whispered. "People reveal things when they don't know they're being watched." David took a step back, his heart racing. There was something off about Mr. Finch's tone, like he wasn't just talking about casual observations. "I'll leave you to it," David said quickly, turning and walking back to his house. But things didn't get better. The next few nights, David couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in his yard. He'd look out his window, and just for a split second, he'd see a shadow move behind the trees, just out of the corner of his eye. The hairs on his neck would stand up, but when he checked, there was never anyone there. Then came the knocking. It started softly, just a gentle tap on the door in the middle of the night. David assumed it was a prank at first, maybe kids in the neighborhood, but it continued. Night after night, the same quiet knock on his door, always around 2 a.m. Each time, when he opened the door, there was no one there. Then one night it was louder, more insistent. He flung the door open, ready to confront whoever it was, but once again, nothing. Just the empty street and the shadows of his quiet neighborhood. But that night, something was different. As he stepped outside, he saw Mr. Finch standing at the end of his driveway, a dark silhouette against the dim light from the street lamp. David's pulse quickened. He was sick of this. "What the hell, Mr. Finch?" he shouted across the yard. "What is your problem?" Mr. Finch's head tilted at an odd angle, like he was sizing David up. The crooked smile stretched wider, almost inhuman. "You know," Mr. Finch said slowly, "people like you don't belong here." David took a step back, a chill crawling up his spine. "What do you mean? I'm just trying to live in peace." "Oh, but that's the problem," Mr. Finch replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've disturbed the peace, and now you must pay." Before David could react, Mr. Finch's form blurred. It wasn't like a regular movement. It was as if he was fading in and out of reality. One moment, he was standing there. The next, he was gone. David was terrified. He stood frozen, staring at the empty driveway. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl from behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering. There, in the shadows of his own yard, stood something wrong. A figure, hunched and deformed, its skin stretched tight over its bones, glowing faintly in the dark. Its eyes were wide and black, like pits that went on forever. "Mr. Finch," David whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure let out a raspy laugh, and with a sudden movement it lunged at him, its hands sharp like claws. David stumbled back, barely managing to avoid the creature's grasp. His mind raced. What was happening? Was Mr. Finch some kind of monster? He turned and ran, but the creature followed, its steps too fast, too unnatural. He could hear its breath thick and heavy behind him, and then another sound. The voice of Mr. Finch calling to him from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, David. I warned you." David dashed toward his front door, but just as he reached it, the creature grabbed him by the ankle, yanking him backward. He screamed, trying to break free, but its grip was like iron. The door burst open, and there stood Mr. Finch, his eyes now glowing in the darkness, his smile wider than ever. "It's too late for you now," Mr. Finch said softly, almost kindly. "You'll be with me, with us, forever. We never let go." David's world went black. The next morning, the neighbors found the front door wide open, but there was no sign of David. No struggle, no trace of him at all. And Mr. Finch, well, he was still there, standing by his window, watching. The watcher in the walls. When Kate moved into the apartment on the edge of the city, she was excited. She wanted to close the previous chapter of her life, and things were finally beginning to look good for her. She'd gotten a new job and a new place, away from the chaos and drama of her old life. The apartment was inexpensive, located in an older building that had a certain charm. Exposed brick, high ceilings, wooden floors. It was everything she'd dreamed of when she pictured her new life. She was eager to settle in and face life one day at a time. Kate's landlord was an elderly woman named Mrs. Covington. She had been kind so far, offering Kate the apartment with only a brief mention of the building's age. "It's got character," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Kate thought nothing of it at the time. Her first week was quiet. There were the usual sounds of city life. Sirens in the distance, the sound of heavy traffic, especially during rush hours, but nothing unusual. She decorated her apartment, unpacked, and slowly began to adjust to her new routine. But as the days went on, she started to notice slightly strange occurrences. At night, the silence in the apartment was almost too perfect. The building was old and creaky. She expected noise. Instead, there was an unnerving quiet. She would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any creak of the floorboards or the rustle of wind against the windows. But the silence stretched on, suffocating and heavy. Then the noises started. It sounded like the faint tapping of steel or something, but it was the same volume everywhere in the apartment. It started faintly at first, just a quiet knock in the middle of the night. Kate would often be startled, wondering if she had imagined it. The taps became more frequent, more persistent, until they became impossible to ignore. At first, she thought the sounds were coming from the pipes or the walls. Random, erratic sounds, like someone was knocking gently from the other side of the plaster. It was strange, but Kate was determined not to be paranoid. She chalked it up to the age of the building, or maybe some renovation happening in the building. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate. Then one night, as she lay awake in bed, she heard it again. It sounded like a sharp tap, followed by a muffled scrape. It sounded like something was moving in the walls. She bolted upright, heart pounding. Was it rats? Or maybe squirrels trapped inside the walls? The sound wasn't random, though, like an animal scratching. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. The next day, she called the landlord. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing, dear," Mrs. Covington assured her over the phone. "The building's been around for a long time. It has its quirks. Don't worry about it." But Kate couldn't ignore it. The tapping continued each night. It got louder in volume and closer in distance. Kate was certain of one thing. Whatever was behind the walls was inching toward her. The silence between the taps felt like a countdown. One evening, as Kate was struggling to fall asleep, she decided to investigate the noise. She crawled across the floor and began knocking on the walls. Her fingers lightly tapped the surface, trying to see if there were any hollow spots, but when she pressed her ear to the wall, she was greeted with nothing but silence. She almost gave up, but then she felt it. A cold draft from a vent near the floor. It wasn't coming from the hallway where the heating system was, but from behind the wall. She was immediately frightened. The tapping in the walls was no coincidence. Something was on the other side, but she didn't know what it was. The next day, she decided to find a contractor. Mrs. Covington wasn't home, so Kate used the opportunity to sneak into the basement, hoping to find something that might explain the strange noises. As she crept down the narrow, dimly lit stairs, she noticed an old wooden door tucked away behind a pile of forgotten furniture. It was locked. She could feel her heart thumping in her chest as she approached the door. She worried that her landlord could return at any moment. Instinctively, she was certain there was something behind it, something that had been hidden for far too long. She pulled at the door handle, but it was stubborn. After several attempts, it finally gave way, creaking open to reveal a dusty, cobweb-filled room. And there, in the far corner of the room, was a small door. Her fingers trembled as she turned the doorknob. Inside was an empty crawl space, a large square opening in the wall. The walls around it were cracked and broken, as if something had been pushed through repeatedly. The air was thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of dread. Kate's stomach churned. Something had been in the walls. That night she could no longer ignore the truth. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. The walls trembled with each knock. Kate froze in bed, unable to move, unable to scream. She felt the presence of something close, something crawling just behind the plaster, something that had been waiting. Her mind raced as the sound grew closer, until finally there was a soft scraping sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate, deep breaths that seemed to come from just beyond her arm's length. Kate sat up slowly, the blood draining from her face. The whisper came next, so soft she could barely make out the words. "Let me out." With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and called Mrs. Covington again. This time, she wasn't so calm. "I need to leave," Kate said, her voice trembling with fear. "There's something in the walls. You have to tell me what's going on." Mrs. Covington was silent for a long moment. The only sound on the line was the soft hum of static. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, almost like a hiss. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. It's out of my hands now. You just have to give him what he wants," she said. "He's been waiting for someone. He's always waiting." The line went dead. Kate never returned to the apartment. She packed up whatever she could, left the keys with the landlord, and never looked back. She tried to put it out of her mind, until one day, months later, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a small, torn piece of wallpaper, the same pattern as the one in her apartment. Written in faded, smeared ink on the back was a message. "I'm still here." The Forgotten Asylum. The wind howled through the barren trees, cutting through the mountain like a forgotten scream. In the distance, the towering silhouette of the old asylum loomed against the night sky. Its cracked windows and rusting gates a testament to years of neglect. The crumbling stone walls, draped in vines, seemed to breathe as if the building itself was alive. A group of urban explorers stood at the base of the asylum's eerie hill, hearts pounding with both excitement and dread. The leader of the group, a brash and fearless thrill-seeker named Lucas, grinned wide as he filmed the scene, capturing every moment for his online followers. "All right, everyone, this is it, the Forgotten Asylum. The place where darkness lives. The place where legends are born, Lucas said, his voice crackling with excitement. "Tonight we'll make history. Get ready to witness something none of you will ever forget." His group, Mia, David, Claire, and Ethan, exchanged uneasy glances. Each of them had their own reason for agreeing to this madness. Mia wanted to prove to her friends that she wasn't afraid of anything. David, the tech geek, hoped to catch something supernatural on his equipment. Claire, the skeptic, was just here for the thrill of the challenge. And Ethan, well, Ethan had his own deep fascination with the past, something he was hoping the asylum would reveal. They made their way up the path, stepping over broken glass and rusted metal pipes. The entrance, once grand, now stood as a decaying arch, sagging and full of mystery. As the group stepped into the darkened halls, the temperature dropped dramatically. They all immediately felt an icy chill. The place had a strange odor. It was the smell of mildew mixed with old, damp wood. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the vast, hollow spaces, the walls covered in peeling paint and faint, cryptic symbols. "Welcome to the forgotten world," Lucas murmured, his voice both mocking and serious as he scanned the room for his next shot. But something was off. The air felt charged, almost alive with a strange energy that made their skin crawl. Mia felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as an eerie chill swept through the hallway, but she pushed it aside as just the wind. They continued deeper into the asylum. The sounds of their laughter became quieter as the oppressive silence weighed heavier on them. In one of the rooms, they found old patient records scattered on the floor, pages yellowed with age. One of the records had a chilling note scrawled in red ink. "Don't let them in." "Okay, that's unsettling," Claire remarked, her eyes scanning the note. "What does that even mean?" Lucas shrugged, brushing it off. "Old crazy people, right? Let's keep moving." They ventured through the crumbling wards, snapping pictures and videos. But the deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Each room seemed to be colder than the last, and faint whispers could be heard from the walls, as though the asylum itself was trying to speak to them. David, who was focused on his equipment, suddenly froze. "I just picked up something on the camera. A shadow moving across the hallway." "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, peering over David's shoulder. David rewound the footage, and sure enough, there was a fleeting, indistinct figure that moved too quickly to be a person. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was something else. "Great," Mia muttered, "so we're not alone after all." Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. The group exchanged nervous glances as the temperature dropped even further, and the walls creaked as if they were groaning in pain. The strange sounds grew louder, now unmistakably words. "Leave. You should have left." Mia's heart raced, and she spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. The hallway stretched ahead in a long, suffocating silence. "All right, this is enough," Claire said, her voice shaky. "I'm out of here." Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed from the end of the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing with a sinister intent. They turned toward the noise, fear creeping into their bones. Something or someone was coming for them. "We need to leave now," Ethan shouted, grabbing his equipment and turning to head back toward the entrance. But as they ran, the building seemed to shift, the hallways stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The doors slammed shut in front of them. They were trapped. Panic set in as the air grew thick with an almost suffocating pressure. The whispers turned into frantic voices, screaming for help, begging for release. In the distance, figures began to emerge from the shadows, pale, gaunt faces with hollow eyes that stared directly into their souls. These were no ordinary ghosts. They were the tortured spirits of the asylum's former patients, souls twisted by years of suffering and neglect. "They're feeding on our fear," Lucas said, his voice trembling for the first time. "We need to stay calm." But it was too late. The fear had already taken root. As they fought to find an escape, one by one, the spirits reached out, their cold fingers grazing their skin, pulling them toward the darkness. Ethan was the first to disappear, dragged into a room that slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Claire screamed, her body trembling with terror, but Lucas, always the leader, urged them to push forward. They stumbled upon the asylum's most terrifying secret in the abandoned morgue, a room that was supposed to be sealed but had been left open. Inside, the floor was covered with old, rotting medical equipment and rows of bodies on gurneys, their eyes wide open as though they were waiting for something. But it was what was etched on the wall that made their blood run cold. The cure is worse than the disease. Suddenly, a horrifying realization struck them. The spirits were not the only thing they had to fear. The asylum itself was alive, feeding off their emotions, trapping them in a never-ending loop. And the worst part was, they were never meant to leave. Mia, frantic and terrified, turned to Lucas for guidance. But Lucas, the fearless leader who had once been so sure, was now barely holding it together. His camera shook in his hands as he filmed the approaching spirits, eyes wide with horror. The twist came when they realized the one who had been guiding them all along, the one who had seemed so confident, was not really Lucas at all. The real Lucas had been one of the first to fall victim to the asylum's dark magic. The person leading them, a spirit taking on the form of their former fearless leader to lure them deeper into the asylum's grip. As the group faced the full force of the asylum's wrath, trust shattered and survival instincts kicked in. But the question was, would they make it out alive? Or was the asylum's horrifying grip too strong to break? The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the asylum's crumbling walls closing in, and the horrifying truth that this place would never let them go. The forgotten asylum had claimed its newest victims. The mysterious stalker. I lived in a small, peaceful town where everyone knew each other. It was one of those places where you could walk down the street, and no matter which way you turned, you'd be greeted by a familiar face. My name is Emily, and I had always felt safe here, until one day everything I knew about safety was shattered. It all started with strange, silent phone calls. At first, I brushed them off as mistakes. Maybe wrong numbers or some prankster kids messing around. Every time I answered, the line would be dead silent, only static in my ear. I didn't think much of it, not until it started happening every day. Each call felt more unnerving, like someone was waiting for me to pick up, and then they'd hang up before I could say anything. The first time I heard a voice, it wasn't a mistake. It was low and raspy, like a man who had been whispering in the shadows for far too long. "Emily," he said, his voice sending an icy chill through me. "I know everything about you." At first I was confused. How could he know my name? How could he know anything about me? I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a random person with a creepy voice. But then, the details started to hit too close to home. "Emily, I saw you wear that red sweater today. You always get coffee at the corner cafe, don't you? That book you were reading last night, I know it. You always read before bed." How did he know these things? No one had seen me at the cafe, and I certainly hadn't mentioned the book to anyone. Panic began to rise in me, but I kept convincing myself it was just a prank. A weird prank, an unsettling one, but a prank nonetheless. That was until it escalated. The calls became more frequent, and the voice became more menacing. "I see you," he would whisper. "I see where you go, who you talk to. I'm always watching." His words were drenched in a sickening promise, one I could feel like a weight on my chest. One evening, the voice grew even darker, his tone now almost threatening. "If you don't leave, Emily, I will make sure you never feel safe again. You and your family won't survive this." I froze. My family? Was he threatening them now too? I tried to tell my parents, but they were skeptical. They thought it was some kid with too much time on his hands, playing a sick game. They thought I was overreacting, but it didn't feel like a game anymore. It felt real. I wanted to tell the police, but what could I say? Someone's calling me and saying creepy things. They'd never take me seriously. But when the calls continued, and something even stranger happened, my parents agreed to report it. That's when the weirdest thing of all happened. The police came to our house, trying to trace the calls. They found something that left them scratching their heads. The calls were coming from my own phone. But how? My phone was often turned off or in airplane mode, or even lying untouched on the table. They were baffled. How could anyone be using my phone when it wasn't even turned on? They suggested we change our phone numbers, move to a different house, maybe take some time away from the area. We did, but no matter what we did, the stalker always found us. New numbers, he had them. A new address, he knew that too. Desperation set in. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up a trap, working with a few tech-savvy friends who helped me install surveillance cameras all around the house. We hid them in fake rocks outside and inside, under the floorboards, on top of cabinets, and even in the plants by the window. We did everything we could to make sure no one could notice them. As night fell, I sat in the dark, my nerves shot, waiting for something to happen. I had no idea if I'd be able to confront this stalker, but I was determined to end this nightmare once and for all. Hours passed, the tension thick in the air, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside, the distant chirp of crickets. Then I heard it, the faintest sound, footsteps soft but deliberate tapping against the floorboards. It was almost past midnight, the hour when everything should have been still and quiet. My heart raced. The footsteps were getting closer, moving through the hallway toward my room. They were so close now I could hear every single step. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911, but as I touched the screen, it lit up on its own. My heart stopped when I saw the message. "Don't bother, Emily, I'm already inside." I froze. It wasn't possible. He wasn't outside. He was in the house. The footsteps I'd been hearing? They were right behind me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My phone was the only light, casting a pale glow that barely lit the space around me. I couldn't see a thing. My pulse hammered in my ears. I pressed my back against the wall, praying for some miracle. The only sound was my breath, ragged and shallow in the oppressive silence. Then came a laugh. It was quiet, but it echoed throughout the room, like it was coming from every corner. "Oh, Emily," the voice whispered in my ear, as though he was right beside me. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my mouth too parched to make a sound. My eyes darted around the room, my body stiff with fear, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But there was nothing, just shadows. "Your clever little trap," he continued, his voice growing louder. "Did you think I wouldn't notice those cameras? You really thought I wouldn't see them?" How? How could he know? We had been so careful, so meticulous in setting everything up. The cameras were hidden so well that no one could have noticed them. I was so terrified, my hands shook as I clutched the phone. It buzzed again, and I couldn't help but check the screen. The blood drained from my face. It was a live feed from one of our hidden cameras, showing my empty room. But there, standing in the middle of the frame, was a shadowy figure, tall, formless, and looming. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything that could be explained. It just stood there, a black silhouette against the faint glow. I swiped to the next camera feed, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. The same thing. The shadow appeared in every room, moving seamlessly from one feed to the next, always facing the camera. It was as if he knew exactly where we had placed them. "You see, Emily?" The voice purred in my ear. "I'm everywhere and nowhere. I'm in the walls. I'm in the air you breathe. I'm in the very fabric of reality around you." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn off the phone, to run, to hide, but I couldn't look away. The shadow in the feed slowly turned its head, as though it knew exactly where I was sitting. Its face was featureless, but somehow I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Suddenly, the phone went black. The room was pitch black again. The voice echoed through the darkness. "Now, Emily, it's time we had a proper introduction." I felt a cold, icy presence behind me, a chill that ran through my bones. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned around. And there it was, two glowing pinpricks of light. Eyes, but not human eyes. They hovered in the darkness, suspended at head height. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Who? What are you? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, almost lost in the darkness. The only response was a low chuckle, sending a wave of terror through me. The room closed in. I knew in that moment I was no longer alone. The stalker had come to claim me. The doll that wouldn't die. It was the summer of 1994, and 10-year-old Lily Martin was a curious girl with a fascination for gruesome and horrific things. She was captivated by ventriloquism, especially Edgar Bergen and his infamous dummy, Charlie Patterson. Little did she know, the fascination would soon turn into a nightmare that would haunt her and her family for the rest of their lives. It all started one bright Saturday afternoon when Lily's father, Rick Martin, stumbled across a small, nondescript shop while passing through the sleepy town of Franhead. The sign above the door simply read, "Tales of Wonder." Drawn in by the peculiar name and the dusty air of mystery surrounding it, Rick walked inside. The shop was cramped, filled to the brim with oddities, ancient books, curiosities from around the world, and strange trinkets. But what caught Rick's eye was a ventriloquist dummy sitting in the corner of the shop, bathed in an eerie amber glow from an old lantern. The dummy had a glossy, lifelike face with a perfectly carved smile and beady eyes that seemed to follow Rick as he moved closer. Despite its somewhat unsettling appearance, the dummy reminded Rick of the joy Lily found in watching Edgar Bergen's performances. He couldn't resist. He approached the counter to ask the old cashier about the doll. The man, thin and with a haggard face, gave him an unsettling smile. "You know," the man said, his voice low and hushed, "when you put your hand inside the doll, he'll come alive." Rick chuckled, thinking it was a strange joke. "What do you mean?" he asked. The cashier's eyes seemed to darken. "He's not just a doll, he's different. You'll see." Ignoring the strange warning, Rick bought the doll and took it home. That evening, Lily was overjoyed to receive the gift. The dummy was named Charlie, and she adored him immediately, spending hours in front of the mirror, practicing her ventriloquism skills. But strange things began happening soon after. At first, it was subtle. Lily swore Charlie's smile seemed to widen when no one was looking, and his eyes appeared to gleam in the dim light. But a week later, things truly escalated. One evening, while Lily was playing with Charlie in the living room, she heard soft footsteps, quick and light, on the floorboards. She turned around, expecting to see her dog, but the room was empty. There, sitting innocently on the couch, was Charlie. The same doll they had locked away in the cupboard earlier that evening. No one had touched it. Yet there it was, smiling as if waiting for them. Panic set in. Lily's uncle Javier was staying with them at the time. One afternoon, when Rick and Lily were out, Javier heard what he thought was Rick calling his name from the living room. He got up to investigate, but found only Charlie sitting on the couch, grinning maniacally. The house grew colder, and things grew even more disturbing. Strange noises became a nightly occurrence. Footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere, whispers calling Lily's name in the darkness, and the chilling feeling that they were being watched. The family could no longer ignore the sinister presence that had overtaken their home. Terrified, Rick and Maria decided the doll had to go. Being devout Catholics, they first tried to cleanse the house with prayer, but that did nothing to stem the growing dread. With trembling hands, Rick placed the doll on the grill in an attempt to burn it. As the flames flickered to life, something truly horrifying happened. The flames wouldn't touch Charlie. No matter how much heat they applied, the doll remained perfectly intact, its smile never wavering. Desperate, they tried to cut the doll into pieces with a knife. No matter how much force was applied to the knife, the blade would not penetrate the plastic. It was as if the doll was protected by an invisible force. In a final act of defiance, they threw Charlie in the trash, hoping to rid themselves of the cursed object. But when the garbage truck arrived, Rick found the doll back in the bin, untouched and unscathed. The family realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than they could handle. So they decided to bury the doll. They dug a hole in their backyard, placed Charlie inside and poured cement over it, sealing it forever. Years passed. The Martin family eventually moved away, but the haunting never left them. Lily, now an adult, still remembers the terror that gripped her as a child. Though they had tried everything to destroy the doll, she wonders, what if it's still out there, waiting for them to return? To this day, Lily fears that Charlie, the doll that wouldn't die, may one day find them again, stalking from the shadows, waiting for the moment when it can finally come alive once more.